Hey everybody, welcome back. It's Gettysburg 160. I am psyched to be here. I'm Garry Adelman, American Battlefield Trust. That's Chris White behind the camera, and we have multiple guests ready to join us here at Herbst or Reynolds, or some say McPherson's Woods, on the first day's battlefield at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Many of you know this place as the woods where the Iron Brigade charged in, or where General John Fulton Reynolds will be shot, and there's a monument over there for that. But we got to back up a little bit and get started here. Remember, we're trying to focus on eyewitness to Gettysburg, eyewitness accounts, and that stuff only makes sense if we describe a little bit about why the people are there in the first place. So in summary, the first day's battle, if you haven't already been disabused of the notion that the first day's battle is a real deal, ferocious battle, let me do that for you. We're talking about 48,000 soldiers, upwards of 30,000 Confederates and 17,000 Union soldiers fighting each other on a wide arc. We're talking about 17,000 casualties, making it in the top 5 most costly days of the entire Civil War. The first day is the real deal. So there's a lot of fighting going on here. And, you could say that the battle is really starting off along the road to my left, your right, the Chambersburg Pike. This is Reynolds Woods. McPherson's barn is over in that direction. The Fairfield Road is over there, and I'm looking directly toward the campus of the Lutheran Theological Seminary. Now, these woods were here at the time of the battle, but like most of the woods on the battlefield, just know that it was an open woodlot at the time. They were grazed by livestock, and if if a tree fell down, a farmer would come, cut up, and use it. So you had ample opportunity to see through these woods. And on July 1st, 1863, through these woods went the advanced elements of the Iron Brigade, okay? But keep in mind, as the battle develops, you're going to have 4 different brigades fighting along this line, sort of, and they're from 2 different divisions, and they're not grouped by division. It's 3rd Division, 1st Division, 3rd Division, 1st Division. So it can't be an easy thing for the division commanders, even at the corps level here at Gettysburg, around these woods, to deal with that, okay? But just for now, know that that 1st Confederate Brigade to come crashing across Willoughby's Run on the other side of these trees here is going to be Archer's Tennessee and Alabama Brigade. They're going to come crashing in, and their first opponent will be the Iron Brigade. You've got Wisconsin troops, Michigan troops, later joined by some Indiana troops. So to start talking about one of these soldiers or more, let's bring on one of your favorites. Here she is, Professor Dr. Carol Reardon here, Gettysburg Foundation, and a whole lot else. Welcome.
You betcha. Thank you, Garry. Always glad to be here. Always glad to share stories of unknown soldiers that just didn't make the history books but probably should have. All of us get drawn into this Gettysburg story through different ways, and a lot of times it's because we have a favorite soldier. Sometimes he's an ancestor, if we're really lucky, and sometimes it's somebody from our hometown. Somebody just clicks with us, sometimes for the oddest reason that you can come up with. The soldier I want to tell you about is somebody who I just learned about in the last year or two. This is his picture. His name is Captain Archibald Norris. Here at Gettysburg, he will command Company K of the 7th Tennessee Infantry. On the morning of July 1st, perhaps 2 miles or more behind me, out by Schoolhouse Ridge, where the Whistler Farm is, these are some of the troops that responded to those very first shots fired by Buford's cavalrymen. And over the next couple of hours, it would be the Alabamians and the Tennesseans of Archer's Brigade that would slowly but surely push the Union cavalry back to where we are right now. That was a fight that traded space for time, and it gave Buford a chance to tell General Reynolds that he had located the enemy, and it gave Reynolds a chance to move his troops forward so that by about 10 o'clock in the morning, the fight that had begun between Buford's Union cavalry and Confederate infantry became an infantry-infantry fight. And it was here that the infantry faced the infantry perhaps for the first time during this battle. What we would have seen in that open woodlot behind us is Archer's Tennesseans coming through here. The Alabamians are a bit more off to my right, your left, but behind me would have been coming the 7th and the 14th Tennessee Infantry. We know something, a little something about our Captain Archibald Norris. When he enlisted in 1861, he was about 25 years old. He was unmarried, and he was a school teacher. He seemed to take pretty well to the classroom, but he was especially known as a bit of a disciplinarian. he could cut it up and have fun with his students. But if you got out of line, he wasn't too shy about making sure that he used his overwhelming physical presence to get them back in line. He was well over 6 feet tall for men of that generation. And he had extremely long legs. When he led from the front, and he was moving so far and so fast out front that his men always had trouble keeping up with him. He rather enjoyed it. He looked at it as a bit of a challenge, and he always said that his company would be out front. His men didn't always appreciate his aggressiveness in this regard, but he's going to be involved in this fight. So just imagine coming up behind us through the woods. We have the Tennesseans coming, the 17th or the 7th and the 14th. And it's up here on this ridge somewhere where General Reynolds is bringing the elite elements of the Iron Brigade on the scene. He's already brought up Cutler's Brigade. They're across the road, across the Chambersburg Pike from us, up around the railroad cut, which came as a big surprise to a lot of people. It wasn't on the maps. And now he's putting the Iron Brigade into line. And he sees the Tennesseans in the woods. Stop them, stop them. And then that bullet hits Reynolds and down he goes. One of the big debates has always been who fired that shot. Everybody, it seemed, wanted to claim that they had done it. There were stories that Alabamians did it. There were stories that Tennesseans did it. There was one man who was a North Carolinian, and he liked to tell stories at a train station in North Carolina. Anytime there's a trainload of Pennsylvanians coming through on the way to Florida, he would kind of pull them aside when they stopped for lunch or refueling and say, Pennsylvanian. I knew a Pennsylvanian once. Well, I didn't know him, but I killed him, and proceeded to tell the story of the death of General Reynolds. Probably that's not what happened here, but just imagine how this was like the critical moment in the opening phase of the battle. And in the aftermath, everybody wanted to be a part of it. Now, I mentioned everybody finds a reason to find a soldier who's kind of interesting to them. Archibald Norris left a bit of a diary. One of the things we know about him was that he opposed secession. He hoped that Tennessee would not leave the Union. And he wrote, "The evils which our once happy but now distracted country is suffering have all been the work of demagogues and politicians." And he made it quite clear that he opposed secession. But when his state left, he tells us something about the power of that concept of state rights. We don't feel the same way about it today, but it's very clear that thousands and thousands of Americans did respond to the concept of state rights and state identity very clearly back then. As Norris wrote, "I owe allegiance to my state, and and though I may regret the steps which my state may take, yet it is my imperative duty to support it." He will get through this day in one piece. We will meet him again, perhaps, when we see what happens with the Tennesseans on July 3rd. But why did I pick him, and why is he important to me? He's not a relative. I have no personal connection to him when it comes to my family, but there is one thing that we do share in common. Captain Norris attended and graduated from Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania. I am also an alum. I'm an alum of Allegheny College myself. So, in salute to a fellow Gator here on the Gettysburg battlefield, Allegheny Gators rule.
Thanks, Carol, as always. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. We are live at Gettysburg 160 in Reynolds or Herbst or McPherson's Woods. You can take your pick. And before we walk on to our next stop, let me just say, Carol talked about General Reynolds dying, but you can see his marker over there. We point that out on guided tours all the time. But, we really don't have a whole lot of accounts for it. We have some, and, one of the best, I think it's Charles Vail, really sort of places it. And when you start looking at a couple of things, what people said, along with the fact that before we had the monument, we had signs here. There was an R carved into a tree, then there was a sign, and then that same sign moved on to another tree as well. Chris is looking for that right now, and I'll even hold up the next one. And if you can't see them both, just trust me, we got two different signs in two different trees, and then it was moved to right where the monument is, and then the monument was there with the sign for a little while at the same time. In other words, Reynolds died in a whole different lot of places, depending on which tree you listen to. And it seems like Frazanito does some pretty good analysis and places it somewhere near this flank marker of the 151st Pennsylvania unit we'll be talking about before long. Now, while we walk and talk, if I may, we're going to walk over this way. I want to just second what Carol said about, this idea of a soldier who opposed secession, but he fought in the Civil War. Let me encourage you, instead of trying to come up with one reason why the South seceded and why soldiers fought, to separate those things. We know why the South seceded. The South seceded because of slavery, but to apply that to why soldiers North and South fought, especially at different points in the war, is ridiculous. So let me encourage you to take that extra step to try to understand this conflict a little bit better. Now, what we're doing is walking through McPherson's or Herbst or Reynolds Woods. God, I'm just going to call it Herbst because that's the real name. As we walk toward this next avenue over here. This used to double as an avenue along to a route that took you to a hotel called the Springs Hotel, the Catalysine Springs Hotel, with the clear, fresh, clean, pellucid water of Catalysine Springs, and you could absolutely cure any ill that you possibly would have at the Springs Hotel, a large facility across Willoughby's Run, which is right in those trees off to the distance. Now, that is going to become important because in the initial fight, the Union soldiers eventually are going to be successful against General Archer and his Tennessee and Alabama soldiers. They crash across the creek, get onto their flank, capture General Archer, but that is not the whole story. I mean, they're fighting just about the largest division in the Confederate Army under Henry or Harry Heath, okay? And they're coming in this direction, and the largest brigade in the Confederate Army is coming up behind them, and that is the Pettigrew's Brigade, which includes a bunch of North Carolinians, including the largest regiment in the Confederate Army as well. So they're coming up this way at that point, and the Iron Brigade is going to be sort of refocusing and shifting their troops around so that the Hoosiers, the 19th Indiana, will be on the left, and that's going to place them right along this road. The road was not here at the time of the battle, facing toward Willoughby's Run, and they're going to be facing a huge regiment in the 11th North Carolina, and there's going to be a bloody fight out there. Now, getting you just a little bit ahead from there, eventually, sorry to spoil the end, the Union is going to get Biddle's Brigade up here. This is a brigade that might move around more in a shorter period of time than any brigade at Gettysburg. They're here, they're there, trying to avoid artillery fire. They've got a reserve regiment called the 151st Pennsylvania. We just walked by them. We're going to talk about them in a second. And in the meantime, the Confederates are trying to make progress there. So you got Yankees on this ridge, you got Yankees out near the road, and you've got Union soldiers bulged out into these woods there, and that's the Iron Brigade. So if I've confused you enough to clean up this mess, I'm going to bring Carol back on here to talk a little bit about some of the soldiers that were fighting along this road. And if any of us would like to, we could reposition or move a little bit away from the road if we'd like, and then Carol, take it away.
Okay. Usually when we talk about the Iron Brigade fight, we know how it goes. It's usually the 24th Michigan and the 26th North Carolina. Their story is incredible. They're both huge regiments. They both are going to stand and take it. We measured their sacrifice in the number of color bearers that fall in both regiments, to the point where historians have tried to reconstruct a name-by-name list in each unit to show how many men died just protecting their flags. We know that Colonel Burgwin of the North Carolinians will be mortally wounded. We know that Colonel Morrow of the 24th Michigan will be seriously wounded. But we get so tied up in that specific story that sometimes we miss other equally intriguing stories happening to the right and to the left. The Wisconsin men oftentimes we just don't hear that much about them here. Private Patrick Maloney gets his 5 minutes in the sun for capturing General Archer, but we don't hear too much about them. And we don't hear that much about the 19th Indiana. The 19th Indiana tends to be left out of an awful lot of the battle narratives. But if we look behind me, we can see where the road dips down. And in that low ground out ahead is about where the 19th Indiana is going to end up being. It wasn't a choice position at all. The conformation of the ground did not give them a high piece of ground like so many of the other men of the Iron Brigade enjoyed. But they had to make the best of it. And it was tough for them because while the 24th Michigan on their right flank is taking on the 26th North Carolina, here comes the 11th North Carolina. The North Carolina extends from this 26th North Carolina's right flank. It smashes right into the 19th and gets into the position that you can see, just before you hit the tree line. It's a piece of high ground that kind of looks down into Willoughby Run and looks down upon the 19th Indiana's line. If you were one of those Indiana soldiers, you're taking fire from the front, but not just from the flank, but from the flank and a little bit above you. And it was a really kind of a freaky place to find yourself in. So they're going to continue the fight. They're going to put up every bit of a hard fight as the men from the 24th Michigan. And one of the people we wanted to feature today was their sergeant major. Now, the sergeant major, there's only one sergeant major in every regiment. If you're fortunate, they even have a sergeant major. He's usually the old and crusty type, the veteran soldier with a lot of experience. He's the senior NCO in your regiment. So, the sergeant major is a man of some clout. If you want to see the quintessential sergeant major, don't use a Civil War movie, but use the Vietnam movie, We Were Soldiers. And there is a sergeant major, Basil Plumley, who pretty much whips those troops into place. And who played him? Oh, some guy named Sam Elliott. Yeah. If you think about Sam Elliott, you have the prototypical sergeant major. But the sergeant major for the 19th Indiana was 20 years old. Far too young in most situations to even begin to claim the authority that goes with that rank. But his name was Asa Blanchard. And Asa Blanchard was the son of a government worker. His father works for the patent office in Washington, D.C. And this just gave Blanchard a chance to occasionally stay in touch with his family. Well, here in the battle, one of the things that Blanchard was in charge of doing was making sure that whenever the flag went down, that somebody responsible picked it up and continued it on. The flag was going down so often, he looked and he happened to see that the regimental commander, Lieutenant Colonel, was picking it up. And he said, no, that's not appropriate, and he's trying to find men of the color guard to come and pick up the colors instead. When he can't find one, he wants to hold on to them himself. And others are trying to take him away from it. It was interesting just to watch them fight over who got the honor of carrying the colors, even after so many had fallen. Well, finally, Asa Blanchard's luck ran out. He was hit in the groin by a bullet. The bullet hit an artery. He basically just bled out. But before he did, he said one thing that was handed down to his family and made it into the history books. And it's one of those, if you ever had the luxury of writing your own last words, we almost hope that they would be something like the ones that he would utter on this day when he said, "Don't stop for me, tell my mother I never faltered." He will die shortly thereafter. And because of his father's connections, he will be buried, and this is his headstone, he will be buried in the Congressional Cemetery in D.C. He does not go back to Indiana. He doesn't go back. He's not buried here, but he gets a very unusual burial place. I picked him for another reason as well. One of the assignments I often give my classes is to look in newspapers after the battle to explore the different ways Americans commemorated their dead. There are some wonderful obituaries. There's some wonderful eulogies. But what we especially find interesting in a macabre kind of way is there is a lot of poetry. If we were English literature kinds of people, we would look at this and say it's a bunch of really bad poetry. It doesn't always rhyme, the structure doesn't always work, but it's the heartfelt expression of love and loss that these poems often recapture. There was a book published, a pamphlet really, in 1864. It was called The Idylls of Battle and Poems of the Rebellion. And the author wrote a poem that he called The Ransomed Banner. And he said it was inspired by the death and those last words of Sergeant Major Asa Blanchard of the 19th Indiana. It's a pretty bad poem. And trust me, I am doing you a favor in not reading it to you today, plus the fact I couldn't really do it justice. But the one thing that the concluding verse is probably worth our attention, because it makes clear that he's probably an Easterner writing it. And then, young martyr of the West, our tears must drown the tribute song, but ever shall thy memory live where right shall battle with the wrong. And this is one of the ways in which soldiers hoped that they would be remembered, and it was one of the ways that certainly a lot of civilians at home are going to find ways to express what they went through. Now, he's our Union soldier of the day. One of those bullets that hit Asa Blanchard was probably fired by the 11th North Carolina. This is Major Egbert Ross. Major Egbert Ross is a young man. He's only about 21 years old as well. I would look to see if there was anything compelling about his background that said that he would make a good major in an infantry regiment. Did he go to VMI or some military school? Did he seem to have natural leadership ability? And mostly you see comments like a callow boy, references to his youth. You can tell, look at that picture, look at that face. You can tell what a young man he is. Whatever his background may have been, he won the approbation of his troops by leading his men in the fight here at Gettysburg on July 1st. He is going to fall in the battle. There are other majors who will fall in this battle, some who are much older than him, but he was only the first one. He was only one officer in the 11th North Carolina to fall here. We were talking earlier about the battle casualties here at Gettysburg, and we look at the 24th Michigan of the Iron Brigade, and we look at the 120th New York, one of Sickles's regiments, on day 2. And both of those regiments lost 8 commissioned officers killed or mortally wounded. And they top the list of Union regiments when it comes to officer deaths. I took a look at some of the Confederate regiments that fought around here, especially this 11th North Carolina. And what I saw really rather stunned me. Yes, Major Ross fell, but so did the adjutant of the regiment and no fewer than 13 lieutenants in that one single regiment. Next year, a year after this battle, when General Robert E. Lee is trying to explain why it's just so difficult to win the war against the Union Army, he's going to say that one of the things his army lacks is leadership on the company and regimental level. And he said that Gettysburg had an awful lot to do with the emptiness of the pool of leadership the Army of Northern Virginia enjoyed going into 1864. When we stop, take that step back, and take a look at not just the fighting that happened here, but the casualties and who they are and where they fall in the regimental structure, you can tell that Gettysburg was absolutely devastating to the junior commander level in the Army of Northern Virginia. The story of the 11th North Carolina here, losing 1 major, 1 adjutant, and 13 lieutenants killed or mortally wounded here, summarizes that for you. And I bet Garry has something to add on to that.
I do. I might have more of an upper, though.
Okay.
We've got Dirty Bernie watching. We've got Uli Bauman. We've got someone with the interesting handle Filet-O-Beer. And we also have somebody here, I think his name is Carl, whose sister's husband fought at Devil's Den, is from Williamsport, which is where I was married, and both of whose parents went to Allegheny College.
Go Gator, go. There you go.
Thank you, Carol. So, eventually this attack, this fighting between the North Carolinians and the Hoosiers is going to go the way of the North Carolinians. I think you know that. You've got Biddle's Brigade fighting savagely out there. You've got the Iron Brigade falling back after so much service all morning toward Seminary Ridge. But remember, I mentioned that Biddle's Brigade has a little bit of some reserve going on. And those reserves are the 151st Pennsylvania. That is not a small regiment. And some may think it's composed entirely of school teachers. We're going to let our next guest work all of that out and tell us the truth about this unit. This is Pete Miele. He's our good friend. You've seen him before. He is the head honcho at the Seminary Ridge Museum. We'll give you a chance to talk about Seminary Ridge Museum a little later, but Pete, let's get right into the 151st.
Yeah, 151st Pennsylvania, yeah. So one thing to remember about the 151st that I think sometimes gets lost is that they are a 9-month regiment, and their muster out is at the end of July 1863. So these men arrive here on the battlefield, the initial fighting in Herbst Woods. They arrive here on the battlefield, and they all know that within a month they get to go home. And that you might think that they're just going to kind of ride it out maybe. And that could not be further from the truth. They are sent back to the seminary early in the day and are going to form the reserve for the First Corps. After the men of Gabriel Paul's brigade, John Robinson's division, are sent up to Oak Hill to contend with the threat there, there's only one reserve regiment left, and that's the 151st Pennsylvania. They're going to go back to the seminary. They're going to go back behind the barricade of rails that has been built as a precautionary measure, according to Abner Doubleday, who commands the corps after Reynolds is killed. And as things start to go bad up here on McPherson Ridge, what Carol just told you, the 151st Pennsylvania is going to be thrown into the fight. And they're going to be thrown in between Chapman Biddle's brigade to the south and the Iron Brigade here in the woods. And one of the men that is with the 151st Pennsylvania that day is a soldier named Jonathan Himmelberger. And try as I might for the last 10 years, I have not found a picture of Jonathan Himmelberger. But I was lucky enough in 2014 to meet some descendants of Jonathan's brother, Harrison Himmelberger. And the family provided me with 4 letters that Jonathan had written to his brother Harrison during his service. And we actually had those letters on display for a while. I want to read you some of the quotes that Harrison had about his service in the Civil War. Jonathan is a 22-year-old mill worker from Berks County, Pennsylvania. So a lot of the men from the 151st Pennsylvania, 5.5 companies, come from Berks County, Pennsylvania Dutch soldiers. And Jonathan writes to his brother in April of 1863, "I tell you, I like soldiering better than ever before." He even talks about joining up again when his term of service is up. So he's really excited about his time here. But then they go through the Battle of Chancellorsville. And they're on a pretty forced march up from Virginia into Pennsylvania in June of 1863. And we see a letter on June 21st that Jonathan writes to Harrison from around Leesburg. And at that time, he says to his brother, "I don't know the time that I come home, but if I have good luck, I will be home before August for certain. Some would say we will be at home on the 4th of July, but I think that is all talk. I don't care if I've seen more fighting. I have seen plenty enough for once." So in the span of 2 months, Jonathan's attitude changes. He's going to come across the open fields between the seminary and McPherson Ridge on the afternoon of July 1st, 1863. The 151st Pennsylvania is going to come here. Chapman Biddle's brigade, the men on their right, the Iron Brigade, are going to begin to pull back. And the 151st is left here almost alone. They look on both sides. They don't have any support. Eventually, they are going to be forced off the ridge and fight behind the barricade of rails on the seminary grounds against Dorsey Pender's division, 2 fresh brigades of Confederates under Abner Perrin and Alfred Scales. Jonathan Himmelberger is killed somewhere on these fields. I think that he was killed out here because his body is never identified. His brother Harrison never finds his body. We think that Jonathan Himmelberger is somewhere in the National Cemetery today, probably in the unknown section of Pennsylvanians. The 151st Pennsylvania fights gallantly here on the west side of town. They are also going to be thrown into the fighting on July 3rd. Pickett's charge. All told, the 151st Pennsylvania is going to go into battle on July 1st with 467 men. The next morning, there are 113 left. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel George McFarland, is wounded 20 paces off the northwest corner of the seminary building. He's dragged in the north entrance of the seminary just as the Confederates come in the south entrance. McFarland is going to lose his leg to amputation, and he is going to be the last patient to leave the seminary hospital on September 16, 1863. It's going to be 7 months before he can even stand up again on his one leg that has survived amputation. So the 151st Pennsylvania, a lot of people call them the School Teachers Regiment. Garry alluded to that because their commander, George McFarland, was a school teacher from Juniata County. There were some school teachers that joined up, but by and large, this is like other Civil War regiments, you have a lot of farmers, you have a lot of farm laborers. Mike Drees has done some fantastic work trying to get to the bottom of that school teacher's moniker. And as much as we want to believe that they were all these school teachers that dropped their books and rulers and go off to battle, there's just not a lot of evidence that shows that they were primarily school teachers. But you have their monument right here.
Yeah, and if I can, by the way, we're standing on an old avenue. This used to be a road here, and you can still see evidence of the road sometimes while you walk it. And I wanted to say that, you know, what a difference an apostrophe can make. If it was the school teachers regiment, it could be, you know, without the apostrophe, it's entirely composed of school teachers. But if it's the school teachers with an apostrophe, all of a sudden McFarland is a school teacher, as far as I know.
Exactly.
It's his regiment, and he's the one telling that story. So I remember the guys on Addressing Gettysburg also getting into that a little bit with Charlie Fennell and Eric, the producer that used to be there as well. So while we walk and talk, I want to learn a little bit about the museum.
Yeah.
But, first, you're with the American Battlefield Trust. We are walking through Herbst Woods and talking a little bit about the first day's actions. And we've really just talked about Pettigrew's brigade, Pettigrew's division, sort of. Used to be Heath's division. Maybe by this time in the fight, he's about to go out of the battle. You know, against various elements of the First Corps here. But before we get on to more fighting here, Pete, tell us a little bit about While We Walk, the Seminary Ridge Museum. What in the world is it, for anybody who doesn't know?
Well, today is a milestone day because it's actually the 10th anniversary of the opening of Seminary Ridge Museum, if you can believe that. I almost can't. But we are located in the original building of the Lutheran Theological Seminary. That building with the cupola, if you've seen the movie, it's the building with John Buford up top, Sam Elliott yelling down to John Reynolds, "What goes, John?
What goes, John?
What goes, John?" It's the devil to pay. And you can go up to that cupola today and see the vista that helped to set up this battle when John Buford climbed up on June 30th, 1863. But we talk about the first day of the battle. As I alluded to earlier, the building is turned into a hospital during the fighting on July 1st, 1863. George McFarland is just one of the 600 to 700 patients that ends up in the seminary hospital, and it's used as a hospital until September 16th, 1863. But even beyond that, we get into some of the debates of faith, of freedom, of slavery, of what it means to be an American in our museum, because it was an active seminary during the battle. It's an active seminary today. But over a period of 30 years, between 1832 and 1863, students within the building, north and south, were debating what it meant to be an American. So we're open 7 days a week. We have dozens of programs this weekend. They're doing programs over there now. But come over to Gettysburg, come and see us. You won't regret it.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Pete. Good timing, by the way. Check us out. We've arrived.
Look at that.
We really encourage you. We do a lot of work with our friends at the SRM, Seminary Ridge Museum, and the exhibits are great. The facility is excellent, so we really encourage y'all to go on by. I'm going to bring on Sarah in just a minute, but first let's bring us up to speed here. So we've got, on this side, again, you might be able to see the McPherson barn over my shoulder over there. You're also looking at McPherson's Ridge over there. This ridge on which we are standing is also sometimes called McPherson's Ridge, but it's really sometimes called the Ripple. It's sort of the second McPherson's Ridge, and Seminary Ridge is over there. We have to go back into the battle just a little bit here to get into the idea that after the Iron Brigade arrives, another Union brigade is coming online, and that's part of a different division, the 3rd Division. That's Roy Stone's brigade. These are Pennsylvanians, and we're going to learn a little bit about them, but just know that they're fighting along that ridge. They're fighting along and near the railroad cut, out near John Reynolds' monument. Was not here during the battle. And there is some savage fighting going on here. In fact, most of the units that suffered the highest casualties for the Union Army at Gettysburg, they all fought, like something like 8 out of the top 10, 25 out of the top 30. This is a dubious honor, of course. We're all in the 1st or the 11th Corps fighting on that first day. And Roy Stone's is no exception. They're fighting terribly hard. And it's actually the 150th Pennsylvania that's right behind me here. And it's that unit that the famous hero of Gettysburg, John Burns, first approaches to go out and fight with the Union soldiers there. So you usually hear about that. Maybe from Stone you hear about them wearing some bucktails. Maybe you hear about, you know, a guy shaking his fist named Ben Crippen at the Confederates. But I think Sarah's got something a little bit different for you. So Sarah Bierle of the American Battlefield Trust, come on.
Thanks, Gary. Yes, I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of an overview, introduction, if you will, to the 150th Pennsylvania, because then we're going to go beyond the war, and I'm going to share a little bit about how some of these veterans tried to remember the war and tried to make sense of the loss and the sacrifices that happened here. As we're here at Herbst Woods, sometimes called Reynolds Woods, we've heard a lot of stories about soldiers who gave that ultimate sacrifice in the fighting here on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. So, but getting to the 150th Pennsylvania, this is a regiment, we recently heard about a regiment that was about to muster out. Well, the 150th Pennsylvania, this is their first major battle, so kind of a different experience here on the other end of the line. So the 150th musters in September of 1862. They spend the early part of their service in the defenses of Washington. They'll go and join the 1st Corps in February of 1863. They're not heavily engaged, not participating actively. They're in the Chancellorsville campaign, so Gettysburg is where they are coming under fire and having to maneuver, fight, and as a first experience on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863. We've got a lot of firsts going on here. So as Garry mentioned, they're going to be coming into this area just over my shoulder here. They're going to come in on the right of the Iron Brigade and be fighting out here for several hours. According to their official report, they are going to maneuver and change fronts several times while they're under fire. This regiment performs well. There will actually be 2 Medal of Honor recipients later from this regiment. So when the war is over and the survivors, the veterans, are thinking about their service, they're trying to make sense of the loss of their comrades and personal sacrifice as well. And I found in an address that was made here at Gettysburg in 1896 to the Survivors Association of the 150th Pennsylvania Regiment, there's an interesting quote where they reflect on it. It's a bit of a longer quote, but I invite you to take this moment to reflect on the sacrifice, on how these veterans think about the war and their service later. He begins with a question. Were we all wrong? Was the loss of property and waste of force and energy, the suffering and pain endured by countless thousands, the destruction of so many precious lives, compensated and more than compensated, as we have always thought and proudly believed, by the splendid results obtained? Or would we have done better, each to have pursued his own little narrow pathway of life, and done the work which laid before him, married his wife, brought up his children without regard to whether he belonged to a great free nation, the hope of liberty for the world, or not? Was our sacrifice in vain? Viewed merely from the prosaic and selfish point of view, we did make great sacrifices. Apart from toil and suffering, apart from the suffering of the protracted march, the distress of heat, the wet and cold, the pain of wound, the anguish of fever, sacrifices individual to every soldier, which his body must remember. There were the pangs of separation from loved ones, endured by ourselves in the field, and to a yet greater degree to those at home. There was also the great pecuniary sacrifice, at which critical age of manhood we absented ourselves from the mart of trade and industry, leaving to those who stayed at home the opportunity to seize every advantage in the race for a successful business life, so that when we returned to the walks of peace, we found the best places already occupied, and learned by experience that despite the loud expressed gratitude to the soldier, we had before us an uphill struggle for the chance of even making a living in civil life. Then many of us came back maimed and crippled, and we left behind us on the hill and plain and swamp and forest many who never returned. The sacrifice was enormous, the suffering intense to the individual, and when attempted to be realized in the mass, inconceivable. So after this reflection and a few more paragraphs, which will move ahead in their speech making here, they begin to draw a conclusion about these individual sacrifices and the greater outcome. And it continues, and yet, my comrades, we feel and know that we did, even for ourselves and our natures, fight and suffer in vain. Apart from the sublime achievements of the preservation of our Union and a united, free America for ourselves and our posterity, our labors were not, we feel, fruitless to ourselves or to the development of our characters. And when we're at places like Gettysburg and we're hearing the individual stories like Dr. Carol Reardon and Pete have been sharing, we can think about these battlefields as a place of, yes, great cause, great outcomes that impact the nation, that impact our national history. It's also places where those individual stories happen, and lives could be changed even for those who walk away from this fight. I think that's an important thing to remember. Hopefully these reflections from the veterans of the 150th Pennsylvania who fought here 160 years ago today, hopefully it gives you a chance to reflect on that as well.
Good. Thanks so much, Sarah. Great stuff. And what a lovely day. There was just a tour over here that actually broke up. And you could still see some of the participants hanging out there at the McPherson barn. During an anniversary, it's the best and worst time to be here. It's the best because everything's going on. There's people everywhere enjoying and interacting with this battlefield. And I think the battlefield is personal. Your experience. You might, have a very somber experience. And some veterans did, by the way. And you might have fun and laugh like a lot of the veterans did as well. And as long as it's legal, we encourage you to make that battlefield experience what it is. Now, one of those experiences I'm having or about to have involves y'all, because I want to update you on the voting. So far, it looks like, according to the votes I've seen so far, that I'm going to shave my beard on Sunday night into a Patty O'Rourke seems to be ahead, with Strong Vincent right behind there. Place your vote in the comments of any of our videos and I'll shave into that. Sunday night, whether I want to or not. I don't like growing my whiskers long, but I've been growing them long with this one purpose. Lastly, somebody asked me to connect Harry Potter with the Battle of Gettysburg, and here you go. We are standing on the first day's field at Herbst Woods, okay? But it's also next to the Harmon Farm, the Hagee Farm, and the Haas Farm, okay? I'm going to use the letter H, Sesame Street style, to bring in Harry Potter, because we got Hedwig, we've got Hagrid, we've got Harry and Hermione and the Horcrux, and there you go, your connection to the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, with that, I'll bet you nobody else has anything to add, because I think we've hit the bottom. Anything else?
Mic drop.
There you go. Chris White behind the camera, Carol Reardon in front of it, Pete Miele in front of it, and Sarah K. Bierle in front of it. Thanks so much for watching, for sticking with us. Place your votes even after the video, and I'll shave the way that you want me to. We got a whole lot more videos coming. We'll live stream tonight from the Adams County Historical Society on a panel about YouTube and the challenges, pros and cons of being a YouTube person as well. And then tomorrow we'll be out on the field. We're not going to tell you where, but if you're in town, come see Chris and Doug Dowds and I out at the Trossel Farm at 2:30, where we'll be talking about all things Trossel Farm for an hour and a half. Thanks for watching and for supporting battlefield preservation and education.